to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Broad Highway by Geoffrey Farnall. Book 2, Chapter 5. In which I hear ill news of George. The sun was pouring in at my lattice when I awoke next morning to a general soreness of body that at first puzzled me to account for. But as I lay in that delicious state between sleeping and waking, I became aware of a faint, sweet perfume, and, turning my head, espied a handkerchief upon the pillow beside me. And immediately I came to my elbow, with my eyes directed to the door, for now indeed I remembered all. And beyond that door, sleeping or waking, lay a woman. In the early morning things are apt to lose something of the glamour that was theirs overnight. Thus I remained propped upon my elbow, gazing apprehensively at the door, and with my ears on the stretch, hearkening for any movement from the room beyond that should tell me she was up. But I heard only the early chorus of the birds and the gurgle of the brook, swollen with last night's rain. In a while I rose and began to dress somewhat awkwardly on account of my thumb, yet with rather more than my usual care, stopping occasionally to hear if she was yet astir. Being at last fully dressed, I sat down to wait until I should hear her footstep, but I listened vainly, for minute after minute elapsed until, rising at length, I knocked softly, and having knocked twice, each time louder than before, without effect, I lifted the latch and opened the door. My first glance showed me that the bed had never been slept in, and that save for myself the place was empty. And yet the breakfast table had been neatly set, though with but one cup and saucer. Now beside this cup and saucer was one of my few books, and picking it up, I saw that it was my Virgil. Upon the fly-leaf at which it was open, I had, years ago, scrawled my name thus, Peter Vibart. But lo, close under this, written in a fine Italian hand, were the following words: To Peter Smith, Esquire, the Smith underlined, blacksmith, Charmian Brown, Brown likewise underlined, desires to thank Mr. Smith, yet because thanks are so poor and small, and his service so great, needs must she remember him as a gentleman, yet oftener as a blacksmith, and most of all as a man. Charmian Brown begs him to accept this little trinket in memory of her. It is all she has to offer him. He may also keep her handkerchief. Upon the table, on the very spot where the book had lain, was a gold heart-shaped locket, very quaint and old-fashioned, upon one side of which was engraved the following posy: He who mine heart would keep for long shall be a gentle man and strong. Attached to the locket was a narrow blue riband, wherefore, passing this riband over my head, I hung the locket about my neck, and having read through the message once more, I closed the Virgil, and, replacing it on a shelf, set about brewing a cup of tea, and so presently sat down to breakfast. I had scarcely done so, however, when there came a timid knock at the door, whereat I rose expectantly, and immediately sat down again. "Come in," said I. The latch was slowly raised, the door swung open, and the ancient appeared. If I was surprised to see him at such an hour, he was even more so, for, at sight of me, his mouth opened, and he stood staring speechlessly, leaning upon his stick. "Why, Ancient," said I, "you are early abroad this morning." "Lord!" he exclaimed, scarcely above a whisper. "Come in and sit down," said I. "Lord! Lord!" he murmured. "And a sat in his breakfast too! Lordy, Lord!" "Yes," I nodded, "and, such as it is, you are heartily welcome to share it. Sit down," and I drew up my other chair. "A eatin' his breakfast as ever was," repeated the old man, without moving. "And why not, Ancient?" "Why not?" he repeated disdainfully. "'Cause breakfast can't be ate by a corp', can it?" "A corpse, Ancient? What do you mean?" I means a corp ain't got no right to eat no breakfast, no. Why, no, certainly not. Consequently, you aren't a corp, you'll be telling me. I? No, not yet, God be thanked. Peter, said the ancient, shaking his head and mopping his brow with a corner of his neckerchief, you do be forever a-giving me turns, that you do. Do I, ancient? Ay, that you do, and me such an aged man too, such a very aged man. I wonders at ye, Peter, and me with my white hairs. Oh, I wonders at ye, said he, sinking into the chair I had placed for him, and regarding me with a stern, reproving eye. If you will tell me what I have been guilty of, I began. I come down here, Peter, so early as it be, too. I come down here to look for your corp after the storm and what happened last night. I comes down here, and what does I find? I finds ye eating your breakfast, just as if there never hadn't been no storm at all. No, nor nothing else. I'm sure, said I, pouring out a second cup of tea, I'm sure I would sooner you find my corpse than anyone else, and am sorry to have disappointed you again. But really, ancient. Oh, you aren't the disappointment, Peter. I found one corp, and that's enough, I suppose, for an aged man like me. No, it aren't that. It's finding you eating your breakfast, just if there hadn't been no storm. No, nor yet no devil, wi' horns and a tail, and running up and down in the holler here, and a roaring and a bellerin', as John Pringle said last night. Ah, and what else did John Pringle say? I inquired, setting down my cup. Why, he come into the ball all wet and wild like, and wi' his 2 eyes a-sticking out like gooseberries. He comes a-busting into the tap, and never says a word till he's emptied old Amos's tankard, that being nighest. Then, by gods, he says, looking around, by gods, I just seen the ghost. Ghost? Says all on us, sitting up. Ye may be sure, Peter. Ay, says John, looking over his shoulder, scared like. Seed un with my own 2 eyes. I did, and what's more, I heard un too. Where? says all on us, beginning to look over our shoulders likewise. Where? says John. Where should I ha' seen him but in that there ghashly holler? I see a light, first of all, a-leaping and a-dancing about among the trees. Ah, and I heard shouts as was enough to curdle a man's good blood. Pooh! What light? said Joel Amos, cocking his eye into his empty tankard. That bain't so much frighten a man, no, nor shouts neither. Aren't I? says John Pringle, fierce-like. What if I tell ye the place be full of flaming fire? What if I tell you I seen the devil hisself, all smoke and sparks and brimstone, a-floating and a-flying and dragging a body through the tops of the trees? Lord, said everybody, and well they might, Peter, and nobody says nothing for a while. I wonder, says Joel Amos at last, I wonder who it was dragging through the tops of the trees, and why? That'll be poor Peter being took away, says I. I'll go and find the poor lad's corp in the morning, and here I be. And you find me not dead after all your trouble, said I. If, said the ancient, sighing, if your arms was broke or your legs was broke now, or if your hair was singed or your face all burned and blackened with sulphur, I could have took it kinder. But to find ye sitting, eating and drinking, it aren't what I expected of you, Peter, no. Shaking his head moodily, he took from his hat his never-failing snuff-box, but, having extracted a pinch, paused suddenly in the act of inhaling it, to stare at me very hard. But, he said, in a more hopeful tone, but your face be all bruised and swole up, to be sure, Peter. Is it, ancient? Ah, that it be, he cried, his eyes brightening, and your thumbs all bandaged too. Why, so it is, ancient. And Peter, the pinch of snuff fell, and made a little brown cloud on the snow of his smock-frock as he rose, trembling, and leaned towards me across the table. Well, ancient? Your throat. Yes, what of it? It be all marked, scratched it be, tore as if claws had been at it, Peter, long, sharp claws. Is it, ancient? Peter, oh, Peter, said he, with a sudden quaver in his voice, who was it? What was it, Peter? And he laid a beseeching hand upon mine. Peter, His voice had sunk almost to a whisper, and the hand plucked tremulously at my sleeve, while in the wrinkled old face was a look of pitiful entreaty. "Oh, Peter, a lad, 'twere old Nick as done it. 'Twere the devil as done it, weren't it? Oh, say 'twere the devil, Peter." And seeing that hoary head all a-twitch with eagerness as he waited my answer, how could I do other than nod? Yes, it was the devil, Ancient. The old man subsided into his chair, embracing himself exultantly. "I knowed it, he quavered. "'Twere the devil flying off with Peter,' says I. And they fools laughed at me, Peter. Aye, laughed at me, they did. And they won't laugh at the old man no more. Not they. Old I be, but they won't laugh at me no more. Not when they see your face and I tell 'em." Here he paused to fumble for his snuff-box, and, opening it, held it towards me. "Take a pinch with me, Peter." "No, thank you, Ancient." "Come, 'twould be a wonderful thing as I took out snuff of my very own box with a man as fault with the devil. Come, take a pinch, Peter," he pleaded. Whereupon, to please him, I did so, and immediately fell most violently a sneezing. "And," pursued the old man, when the paroxysm was over, "did ye see his horns, Peter, and his—" "Why, no, Ancient. You see, he happened to be wearing a bell-crowned hat and a long coat." "An hat and coat!" said the man in a disappointed tone. "A hat, Peter?" "Yes," I nodded. "To be sure, the Scripters say as he goeth up and down like a ravening lion, seeking whom he may devour." "Yes," said I, "but more often, I think, like a fine gentleman." "I never heerd tell of the devil in a bell-crowned hat before. But p'r'aps you'm right, Peter. Take another pinch of snuff." "No more," said I, shaking my head. "Why, it's apt to ketch you a bit at first, but, Lord, Peter, for a man as fought with the devil—" "One pinch is more than enough, Ancient." "Oh, Peter, 'tis a wonnerful thing as you should be alive this day." "And yet, Ancient, many a man has fought the devil before now, and lived, nay, has been better for it." "Maybe, Peter, maybe, but not on such a terrible wild night as last night was." Saying which, the old man nodded emphatically, and, rising, hobbled to the door. Yet there he turned and came back. "I nigh forgot, Peter. I have news for ye." "News?" "News as ever was. News as'll surprise ye, Peter." "Well?" I inquired. "Well, Peter, Black Jarge be took again." "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I knowed 'twould come. I knowed he couldn't last much longer. I says to Simon, day afore yesterday it were, 'Simon,' I says, 'mark my words, 'e'll never last the month out, no.'" "How did it happen, Ancient?" "Got tur'ble drunk, he did, over to Cranbrook. Throwed Mr. Scrope, the beadle, over the churchyard wall. Knocked down Jeremy Tullinger, the watchman, and then went to sleep. While he were asleep they managed, cautious like, to tie his legs and arms, and locked him up mighty secure in the vestry. As ever, when he woke up, he broke the door open and walked out, and nobody tried to stop him. Not a soul, Peter." "And when was all this?" "Why, that was the very point," chuckled the Ancient. "That's the wonnerful part of it, Peter. It all happened on Saturday night, day afore yesterday as ever was, the same day I says to Simon, 'Mark my words, he won't last the month out.'" "And where is he now?" "Nobody knows, but there's them that says he's making for Sefton Woods." Hereupon, breakfast done, I rose and shook my hat. "Where away, Peter?" "To the forge. There is much work to be done, Ancient." "But Jarge bain't there to help ye." "Yet the work remains, Ancient." "Well then, if you'm going, I'll go with ye, Peter." So we presently set out together. All about us as we walked were mute evidences of the fury of last night's storm. Trees had been uprooted, and great branches torn from others as if by the hands of angry giants, and the brook was a raging torrent. Down here, in the hollow, the destruction had been less, but in the woods above the giants had worked their will, and many an empty gap showed where, erstwhile, had stood a tall and stately tree. Trees be very like men, said the ancient, nodding to one that lay prone beside the path. Here to-day and gone to-morrow, Peter, gone to-morrow. The man in the Bible, him as was cured of his blindness by the blessed Lord, he said as men were like trees walking, but to my mind, Peter, trees is much more like men a standing still. You see, Peter, trees be such companionable things. It's very seldom as you see a tree growing all by itself, and when you do, if you look at it, you can't help but notice how lonely it do look. Aye, its very leaves seem to have a downhearted sort o' drop. I knowed 3 of 'em once, elm trees they was, growing all close together, so close that their branches used to touch each other when the wind blew, jest as if they was shaking hands with one another, Peter. You could see as they was uncommon fond of each other with half an eye. Well, one day along comes a storm and blows one of 'em down, kills it dead, Peter, and a little while later they cuts down another, Lord knows why, and there was the last one, all alone and solitary. Now I used to watch that there tree, and here's the curious thing, Peter, day by day I see that tree a drooping and drooping, a witherin' and a pinin' for them other 2, brothers you might say, till one day I came by, and there it were, Peter, a standing up so big and tall as ever, but dead. Aye, Peter, dead it were, and never put forth another leaf, and never will, Peter, never. And if you was to ask me, I should say it died because its 'eart were broken, Peter. Yes, trees is very like men, and the older you grow, the more you'll see it. I listened. It was thus we talked, or rather, the ancient talked and I listened, until we reached Sissinghurst. At the door of the smithy we stopped. Peter, said the old man, staring very hard at the button on my coat. Well, ancient? What about that there poor old rusty staple? Why, it is still above the door, ancient. You must have seen it this morning. Oh, I seed it, Peter, I seed it, answered the old man, shifting his gaze to a rolling white cloud above. I give it a glimp over, Peter, but what d'ye think of it? Well, said I, aware of the fixity of his gaze and the wistful note in his voice, it is certainly older and rustier than it was. Rustier, Peter? Much rustier. Very slowly a smile dawned on the wrinkled old face, and very slowly the eyes were lowered till they met mine. Lad, I be glad o' that. We be all growing older, Peter, and, though I be a wonderful man for my age, and so strong as a cart horse, Peter, still I do sometimes feel I be growing rustier with length o' days, and 'tis a comfort to know that that staple a growing rustier along with me. Old I be, but the staple's old too, Peter, and I be waiting for the day when it shall rust itself away altogether, and when that day comes, Peter, then I'll say like the old patriarch in the Bible, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. Amen, Peter. Amen, said I, and so, having watched the old man totter across to the bull, I turned into the smithy and set about lighting the fire. End of Book 2, Chapter 5.